So the energy of boredom, the virya of boredom. And perhaps ironically, what I found in preparing this talk is that boredom is fascinating and wonderfully interesting. In fact, I found myself having so much that I'd like to talk about. I'm going to do part 2 of this talk next week when I'm also up for giving a talk. One piece that I found that I really found compelling was written by a Roman poet, Lucretius, in the 1st century BC. And I think it so clearly describes the energy of boredom. I wanted to share this with you. A man leaves his great house because he's bored with life at home, and suddenly returns, finding himself no happier abroad. He rushes off to his villa, driving like mad. You'd think he's going to a house on fire, and yawns before he's put his foot inside, or falls asleep and seeks oblivion, or even rushes back to town again. So each man flies from himself. Vain hope, because it clings to him the more closely against his will, and hates himself because he is sick in mind and does not know the cause of his disease. Sick in mind, not knowing the cause of our disease, boredom. You know, if I hadn't told you what century that had been written in, we might have assumed a much more current author, describing the often desperate looking outside of ourselves for relief from this energy, this state of boredom. From a dharmic perspective, this so aptly describes the hindrance energies of restlessness or sloth and torpor that arise from what we often label as boredom. And boredom might be better understood as a state of being discontent with whatever my experience is in this moment. And this might simply be a result of a lack of interest in my present moment experience, or a more pronounced aversion or wanting to avoid and push away what might be painful or distressing in my experience. And if we think about the feeling tone, the Vedana of the experience of boredom, it's generally unpleasant. At best, it may be neutral, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, as when we're just not able to engage our interest, like when we're sitting and trying to follow our breath. At least if you're like me, sometimes that's a hard interest to maintain. And at worst, it's extremely painful, as in the poem by Lucretius, the bored person is described as hating themselves, feeling sick in mind. Today, we have common phrases like bored to death. And think about how many times in your life you said, oh, I was bored to death. Bored to death. That's suffering. Or bored to tears. That's painful. And that's the way we capture the distress and suffering of boredom. Just like the person in our poem who rushes from one place to another, driving like mad, looking outside of themselves for relief, our habitual reaction to boredom may be this restless, agitated energy. It certainly seems so common in our world today that we look for distraction, for being entertained, being busy, whether it's on our texts, our tweets, our Facebooks, our games, our social media, looking for the coolest new music or another book to read or the latest series that can grab my attention on Netflix. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with these activities, but I need to discern when I'm using them to escape or avoid my experience in this moment, and labeling it boredom as if that gives me permission to, of course, run away from that state. On the other hand, this poem also points out the sloth and torpor energy that can be found in boredom. For me, that's often a shutting down, tuning out, a dullness, a lethargy, a yawning, falling asleep, seeking oblivion. I think of clients I've worked with in my counseling, which has been about addictions and the agitation and the energy that can be found in stimulant abuse versus, kind of the oblivion found in opioid abuse or other addictive activities and so often the clients will say, why do you do this? It's out of boredom. I'm bored. My experience isn't enough. And we can put these together. Often for me, the energy of boredom feels like a restless lethargy. I've got this restlessness, but I'm drained and lethargic at the same time, and that's so uncomfortable. I'm agitated, but have no focus of what to do with it. It's exhausting. It drains my energy. I just want to fall asleep and be oblivious. It can feel like an agitated paralysis, this sense of nothing being enough, no stimulation being good enough. I want bigger highs. I want more intense experiences, more interesting, more exciting, more fun. What's wrong with me? I'm boring. Nobody in our world should be boring. I'm not at ease with just being myself and that being good enough. And as in our poem, I fly from myself hopelessly because I can't get away from myself. Interestingly, I was reading also a current piece of research from the University of Virginia, and they had their research participants given the choice. You can choose to be in silence by yourself, or you can choose to get electric shocks. Guess what? The most people chose. They chose to get an electric shock. I'd rather be in physical pain getting shocked than be alone with myself. That's how aversive many people find that. It's not that, it's just not interesting. It's so averse, I'd rather be in physical pain. Indeed, the story or myth, however you choose to think of it, of the Buddha's enlightenment, the second of the temptations that Mara sends, and Mara is the adversary who sends all these obstacles and temptations to keep the Buddha from achieving enlightenment. The first were sensory desire. The second was boredom, in Pali arati, which is often translated as boredom or discontent. That's how important coming to face boredom is. Just as in the Roman poem, the myth of the Buddha's enlightenment, the cure for this energy of boredom isn't to seek outside of ourselves, not to jump off our cushions or our seats and get busy, find a distraction. Rather, it's to continue to sit, to keep our seat in the face of this unpleasant, so unpleasant it can feel like death and bring us to tears, energy of boredom. and lean into it and understand boredom more deeply. Rather than looking outside of ourselves, the answer is within. When we recognize the boredom energy and its distress and discomfort, as Susan says, appreciate that we're noticing that. Give ourselves a big gold star. There you are. My boredom. Isn't that interesting? How interesting that you've arrived in this moment. And as soon as I take an interest in boredom, I'm no longer bored. I'm now interested. My mind, and I become curious and engaged, and my mind is no longer seeking escape or distraction or something better. I've changed my relationship to my boredom. I can see my boredom as an honored guest with learning and wisdom to offer, not as an enemy to be feared or defeated. I'm connected to my current embodied experience of boredom, and I can choose a beneficial response, lean towards and explore if that's right for me in this moment, or simply let it be. There you are, my boredom. Or release, not pushing away, not kicking out the door, just letting it go for the moment and returning to my breath. So we can choose, not like the man in the poem, we can choose to not hate ourselves in our current experience, but learn to love ourselves in this present moment by facing, exploring, coming to understand the causes of this dis-ease of boredom, this sickness of mind and suffering of our boredom. So thank you so much for your kind attention.